My name's Kathleen Vergers and I'm one of the pastors that works here at Compass. Let's just take a moment to pray before we start. God, I just thank you for highlighting the theme of our hearts this morning in pre-service prayer. I thank you that you are here to heal our hearts, to do a great work in our hearts. So we come with open hearts and ask that you do a mighty great thing in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if you're new to Compass, we've been spending the last few months working through the stories of Jesus. And we're about the point into the series now where I thought it might be helpful just to do a little bit of a timeline recap of the different places Jesus lived and why. And I guess I would even invite you to think about the different places you've lived and why. I know some of you, I can see some of you have come from really far away, which is very exciting for us. But it makes me wonder, why did God bring you here? What's the purpose of you being planted here? And I think back to the beginning for Jesus, and it was kind of an unlikely story in a way of why he was born in Bethlehem. It's kind of unlikely that at that particular time he would need to return to his parents' origins in Bethlehem from Nazareth, about 150 kilometre travelling to do a Roman census. And both of his parents had family, yet there was a crowd of people coming to Bethlehem because it was the place of Judea, which was linked to a lot of King David's ancestors. So even though only probably 2,000 to 3,000 people lived there, a lot of people were kind of from there. So when Mary and Joseph travelled that 150 kilometres, they would have had quite a few people travelling with them. We just sort of think of them by themselves with a donkey, but they probably had friends and maybe some family members with them. Now, they should have stayed with family, but they were a bit more rushed than they expected, and they didn't have time to go searching for family members. And a lot of their family members already had faraway guests staying with them at that time because the places were quite small. So they found themselves giving birth where the animals were in a stable. And of course there were angels and there were shepherds, but surprisingly there were no magi, and that means wise men. They weren't there yet. I feel we've got really messed up from those nativity scenes. They've really crossed wires here. But we do know that at day 8, they were a great Jewish family. They, of course, needed to find a temple and get Jesus circumcised and publicly named. The name had been given by an angel prior to his birth, so they knew it's okay, we can call him Jesus, and they did. And on day 40, as per custom, they took him to Jerusalem, which was about 8 kilometres from Bethlehem, and they took him to the temple to be dedicated, just like a lot of you take your babies here up on stage to be dedicated to the Lord. So did Mary and Joseph. And Jesus received some very exciting prophecies on day 40. Now, there's a little bit of confusion about what happened next because Luke and Matthew have slightly different recounts, but scholars tend to veer towards Matthew's recount that they actually went back to Bethlehem for about 2 years. So for those 2 years, they most likely lived with family, and we know that when the Magi found them, they came to a home. They weren't living in a stable for 2 years. They were in the home, probably a family, and the Magi, we know it was 2 years because the star that they followed had been witnessed by them 2 years prior. So talk about being in the right place at the right time for what would come next. I think sometimes we wonder why we're here, but we don't realise it is so important we're here right now because God knows what's coming next. And God warned the Magi and Joseph actually in separate dreams by angels that they needed to flee to Egypt, Joseph and Mary, and the Magi needed to go back a different way, to a different place, because Herod the Great was very threatened by Jesus being born. Now, there was 2,000 to 3,000 people living in Bethlehem, and his order for the firstborn males under 2 to be killed was indeed acted out, and scholars tend to theorise that around 20 local baby boys were killed in Bethlehem, and around the outskirts, probably another dozen more. But thankfully, due to Joseph's dream, he packed up his little family in the middle of the night and he fled about 60 kilometres into Egypt, which was not under the jurisdiction of Herod the Great. There he was politically safe. And thankfully, the Magi had come just in time to fund their travel and their life as kind of expats in Egypt. So thankfully, Joseph's trade was still very helpful for him to work in Egypt, but that gold was essential. And it's probably fairly likely that they took a boat ride to Egypt for part of that journey, and then for the rest of the 60 kilometres, they could have hired donkeys, they could have walked for part of it. But when they got to Egypt, Joseph worked, and it's likely they didn't stay there very long because our history books tell us that Herod the Great actually died around that time. So it may have been less than a year for all we know, but we don't know exactly. But again, thankfully, warned in a dream, Joseph was told by the Lord, take your family to Israel. And so instead of returning to Bethlehem, where things were kind of comfortable, he needed to avoid that area because Herod the Great's son was reigning now, and he thought it was safest to actually go back to Nazareth, where they had family members, particularly Mary's family, and they set up home and they really planted roots. And Jesus' father, Joseph, was either a stonemason or a wood carpenter, but slightly more likely a wood carpenter. So Jesus did two things in Nazareth. He learnt the trade of his father, and he learnt the scriptures of the Torah, and he learnt the prophets' prophecies, and he memorised scripture as customary as being a Jewish child and a Jewish boy. And the location here at Nazareth was it was sort of 1,600 to 2,000 people in population, and it was sort of in the hills of Galilee. And it was a pretty good place for them to raise their son and all of the other children that they went on to have. So this kind of was going pretty well until Jesus started to do ministry in other places. And when the Nazarenes heard some of the things that Jesus was doing, they started to put some demands on him. They're like, hey, show us what you got, show us what you got. But their hearts went in the right places. And it just became, Jesus wasn't liking where they were coming from. And he actually said, you know what, no, I'm not going to do this the way you're asking me to. And they became violent. They became aggressive. And eventually they grabbed him and kind of held him over the edge of a cliff and then ran him out of town. And I mean, these were the people Jesus grew up with. These are the people that he was in relationship with. These were some, distant family members. These were his friends, people he'd studied with in the temple, people he was in fellowship with. And I can't imagine how rejecting that must have felt. And how he felt when he was run out of town and he then travelled for 50 kilometres to Capernaum. And what looked like a horrible rejection, in essence, was a divine positioning, because this was a massive upgrade in ministry. And I'll tell you why. Because Capernaum, which was on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is actually a lake, not a sea, was this incredibly pivotal place for news and goods and export things going out far and wide. In fact, it was a stopping point on the Via Maris, which was this ancient road where people exported commercial goods. And there was another important road that crossed over it. And basically from Capernaum, you could get news or goods out to Africa, Asia, Europe. It was if it was a social media point, it would be Twitter. It would be like, let's get this to the world right now. So in terms of ministry, even though Jesus would go other places, this was very much home base. And at the age of 30, here he was in Capernaum, 50 kilometres from his immediate family, and more than likely living in the home of Peter, Peter's wife, and Peter's mother-in-law. A lot of people think because he was a single man, it was customary for them to live with a family, and there's a few verses that kind of indicate that that's probably who he lived with, even though obviously he was out and about a lot. So here in Capernaum, we actually read a huge amount of the stories about Jesus. There was some of his teaching there in the surrounding towns, a lot of his miracles and healings. But what I want to talk to you about today is this 48-hour window frame that was pretty extraordinary, where Jesus had just found out that his very much loved cousin, John the Baptist, had been beheaded. And he wanted desperately to go and grieve and cry and just have this moment with God and have space. But the people knew too well what he could do, and they hunted him down and they said, "Heal me, do this, I need this miracle." And he looked at them with compassion and he decided to just teach them. And, several hours into this teaching, he looked at them again with compassion and he saw that they were hungry. And Chrissy did a great job sharing the story of what happened when they were hungry. And she told you, and you would have read as well, that when Jesus held a little boy's lunch in his hands, he held it and he blessed it. And under the sound of his voice and by the touch of his hand, that food turned from natural to supernatural. And it turned into a blessed substance that was a provision and a meal for many. And the disciples watched. And Mark, a teenager at the time, tells us that their hearts were hardened, so they didn't understand. Now, I am very keen to have a good chat with Mark in heaven. I've got lots of things to talk to him about. But one of the things I want to ask him was, are they ever meant to understand? Can't they just believe? But obviously they didn't really believe. Can't they just know that it happened? How could we ever understand a miracle? The whole point of a miracle is faith. He writes, but their hearts were hardened, and that's why they didn't understand. So Jesus sets up a little bit of assistance here, and he pops all of the disciples, or at least some of the disciples, onto a boat. He says, off you go across the lake, I'm going to pray. Because remember, he still hasn't had that time with God since he found out about his cousin who he loved, who died. I'm talking about John the Baptist. He still hadn't had that moment with God. But the more I think about what he might have prayed about, the more I think about the fact that he must have been praying about the disciples because of what happened next. And so the disciples had been battling against the wind until the third or fourth watch of night, which means around 4 a.m. in the morning. They're still trying to cross this fairly small lake. And they just were getting nowhere. Even though they were fishermen, several of them, they were highly capable and highly experienced. They were getting nowhere. And deeply afraid for their lives, they spot something in the distance. And that's what I want to share with you, something now. I've got a few people who I've asked to give you some different sides of a story. And I feel like in a moment I'll ask them up, but I feel like I know a lot about different sides to stories because before I worked here as a pastor, I was a teacher for 20 years. And actually at the moment I'm in a school, I'm helping a local school by teaching RE. And I've noticed on my timetable I had 3 yard duties in the junior school. And I went, because I know that when you do yard duty in the junior school, there's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 sides of every story. And you have to solve it, and you have to sort it out and make sure no one's offended, everyone's got a Band-Aid, no one's upset, there's no emails written. You've got to make sure everything's okay. So I know that there can be so many sides to a story, and I thought John Sutherland might share John's side of what was about to happen, and Matthew Venn might share Matthew's side of what's about to happen. Please come up.
So, Maddie, it's not a competition.
But it is.
Thanks, John. I actually get Matthew when I'm in trouble, so I hope I'm not in trouble. It's usually Matt.
Come on over.
Oh, come over. I'm out of room. I'm out of rope.
All right, okay.
So I'll just
All
stand
right,
here.
so John,
I'll match.
when you were on the boat and you were terrified, now we think John was on the boat. There's no actual scriptural evidence, but based on the detail of his recount, it's most likely he was an eyewitness. And remember that this was penned several decades after it happened. So we're kind of counting on you, John, to tell us this story. What are you going to tell us?
Well, I was there.
Okay, good.
The local pronunciation is Capernaum.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
But
Thank you.
give you the heads up. So I'm going to read from the New International Version,
Go
not
for
the
it.
Hebrew Pigeon.
And can I just point out, John is one of John's names. He has several names because he's so accomplished. But we're going to really call on the name of John today.
Thank you. Off we go.
Go.
When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading.
Okay, so I just want to see if I've got this right.
You have.
I've managed to find a photo of what happened. Is that right? Is that what happened? Is that correct?
That's pretty right, yeah.
Okay.
Slightly different clouds, but
Oh, okay. Okay. Is there anything missing?
The boat.
the boat.
Oh, okay. Sorry, do we have a boat? Oh, good.
Do we have a vote for the boat? That's
Is
the boat.
that correct?
That's the boat. That's the very same boat.
Is that pretty bang on?
That's all that happened.
Okay.
Nothing else happened.
I really appreciate your side of the story.
No further questions.
Thank you. Matthew, what happened? Come on, let's get to the bottom of
Something a little bit
this.
different happened, John. Sorry about this, but you probably missed the most important bit about me. I'll tell you
No, I
now. I'm
didn't.
going to tell you the story. Now, there's another thing too we should remember. It was really, really noisy. If you've been on the water in a storm, there's none of this quiet reading stuff. I'm going to read it how it actually happens. All right?
Good on you.
The sound guy's panicking because he's got his hand on the fader to slide it down because I'm going to deafen everyone. But I know how to use a microphone. Okay, here we go. Ready?
Bit harsh. Matt was in our life group.
Here it comes. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the winds because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost!" they said as they cried out in fear. Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Lord, wrong use of the microphone. "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
Can't wait to see his Hamlet.
Sorry, what?
Can't wait to see your Hamlet.
I can't help it, John. You know me.
It too, Brute.
All right, thank you. Wait, before you go, I'm a bit confused. You know those spot the difference photos, what's different? I'm just hearing a lot of different things. John, I know you call yourself the one that Jesus loved. Is there any reason that can we see a picture? Is this what happened? Is this more like it?
That's how I remember it, absolutely.
Are you sure?
Yeah, 100%.
John, what's going on?
I may have been texting at the time. I may have.
All right. Thank you both. Thank you. You can go. Thank you. Okay. Well, my life's too short to figure out what's going on there. I know that John was the other cousin, actually, of Jesus from Mary's other sister, and I know he calls himself the one that Jesus loved, but I don't know if it was necessary to leave that out. But, it's not for me to judge. But now I'm thinking about Peter, okay, and I'm thinking about the relationship. I'm thinking about the type of relationship that would be required to say to Jesus, invite me out. And because initially they hadn't sensed the presence of Jesus. The clouds were blocking their view and they hadn't sensed the presence. But Peter does more than sense the presence. He acknowledges Jesus and he actually starts to host the presence and power of Jesus. And he actually taps into that power for himself to operate in. He says, invite me out. It's like this grand moment of faith. And Jesus just said one word. He said, come. And it just reminded me of the Lazarus story where Jesus said to a dead man in a cave, come out, Lazarus. And sometimes all you need is the word from Jesus, come. And we're just to obey. And Jesus said, come. And Peter put his leg out of the side of the boat and he put his feet firmly on the substance that had been his fear. They were afraid of the waves. They were afraid of the wind. They were terrified. They thought they were going to die, yet the substance of their fear became the platform to Jesus to meet them in. The thing that we are afraid of is the opportunity and invitation for Jesus to come and meet us right there in the middle of it. Now, I don't know how many sermons that Peter himself preached where he just dropped that little story in, because I know I would. That day I was with Jesus in the storm and he said, come, and I was walking around with him. But at some point in his grand moment of faith, he took his eyes off the power that he was hosting in that moment. And he took his eyes off and he became, instead of Jesus' focus, he became self-focused and self-conscious and conscious of the fear that consumed him. And the storm overtook him and as Matt read, he just said, help, as he drowned. And Jesus took the hand that had held the bread, he took the hand that had multiplied the bread, and he took Peter's hand and he supernaturally put them together in the boat. And the moment they went in the boat together, the storm stopped. When we have Jesus in the boat with us, we are accessing the peace of Jesus, the safety, the comfort, the provision of being in a boat with Jesus. And it's an incredible story. And I feel for Mark and John, who didn't include it in their gospel, because it was such an opportunity to be able to say, I helped propel one of the greatest miracles of all time out into the world. But I'm so glad that Matthew did. Because in fact, there are several times in Scripture where Matthew picks up on that relationship with Peter, the heart relationship between Peter and Jesus. It's only 2 chapters later that Matthew pens down some words that captivate me. And it's where Jesus said to Peter in front of some Pharisees, who do you say I am? And Peter said something he'd already said. When he was pulled out of the water and when he was drowning, he said, you are the Son of God. And in that moment, he was no longer looking at just the Son of Man, who Jesus was. He was looking at the divine. He knew, you are the Son of God. You are divine. And when Jesus, 2 chapters later, say, who do you say I am? Peter was just talking from experience. He's in a relationship where he could say, you are the Son of God. And then Jesus says, well, on that rock, on that truth, on the knowledge that I'm divine, I'll build my church. And the gates of hell will not prevail. So that was, someone had to get it, and it was Peter that got it. In order for the church to be what the church was meant to be, someone had to get it. And Peter got it from relationship. He got it from experience. He got it from living in faith. And it made me wonder, what are the different types of storms that we find ourselves in? Because I think we're either in a storm, we've just come out of a storm, or we're just about to head into a storm. Everyone I've ever met. And sometimes it makes me wonder, what is this particular storm? Because a lot of the times we kind of find ourselves in a storm of our own making. And, you see someone, they might be pre-diabetic, and they're scoffing down a Big Mac meal and the little packet of lollies in their pocket, and they end up in a diabetic coma and a huge health crisis, and that might be a storm of your own making. Or there might be someone in the kind of sin, maybe they're cheating on their spouse, and their spouse wants to leave them, and their kids don't want to talk, and you go, that might have been a storm of your own making, I'm not sure, but maybe. And I think all of us have at certain times been in storms of our own making. But the good news is, even when we're at fault, Jesus is still using the fear and the doubt and the condemnation just to walk over top of it. It's under his feet and meeting us in the middle of it. And he's still willing to get in the boat with us so we can actually do things his way and be obedient and go out into the deep. Because, church, we were not meant to stay in the harbour. Those little fishing boats, they can stay in the harbour sometimes. But ships are meant to go out into the deep. And, church, we are meant to be going out into the deep. Because if there is a sailor, they know how to use those winds for their advantage. They're not going to be crushed and beaten down by the winds. They're going to go, the wind is there, I will go into the wind and I will use it to sail through. And church, we are needing to use the winds of adversity to actually go through to where God is wanting to take us and no longer stay in the harbour. Now, there are also these storms of rearranging, and I think that's what the storm that they were in. There was just this invitation for rearranging where God allowed the storm. Now, I don't know what Jesus prayed in regard to the storm that he knew what was about to happen, but these storms blow off selfishness. They blow off doubt, fear, shame. They give us a clean self to be able to move forward into the next season, which is probably not another storm. And these kinds of storms just come from the world. They can come from other people doing things to us, leveraging off us. They could come from an illness that is no fault of our own, but something we're suffering with, something that we never, ever expected to find ourselves in. It could be wanting a baby for a long time and still not having one and having the storm in our heart. Or it could be an unexpected pregnancy at a really inconvenient time. Or it could be a betrayal, the deepest kind, the heart kind of betrayal. These are the storms that are an invitation for Jesus to... I'm even thinking about people who are out of work, even now, and you just don't even know when the next job is coming. That is just the best platform for Jesus to walk right over to you on top of the storms of fear and uncertainty and meet you and say, put your hand in my hand. Let's go in the boat together. Let's find peace. Let's find refuge. But then the other kind of storm I really, really don't like. And they're not very often, but occasionally, I think we find ourselves in a storm caused by the enemy where things happen. I feel like the older you get, the quicker you are to pick up on when this is happening. Maybe a child wakes up for 2 weeks in a row with night terrors every single night. Or maybe your whole house gets woken up at a certain time every night. Or maybe your car only breaks down on the way to church. You're getting slammed from every angle and every direction. It's just not normal. And that's when you have to realize our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against principalities and powers. And it is calling on the name of Jesus that will actually command that to stop, to be still, and just to get in the boat and keep going forward. So I don't know what particular types of storms you're facing, but I know that Jesus' hand that multiplied the food and that pulled Jesus out of the water is out for you to take. And I was just thinking actually about a man in our own church who had a very real storm of his own recently, and it was a health storm, and he had terrible prognosis for his heart. Yet Jesus, in that storm, healed his heart before the surgery. On the day it was decided this surgery is no longer needed. And I thought, what better recipient of faith and recipient of the power and the might of God than to invite Conrad to come with Troy now and just take this song as an opportunity to put your hand and your heart and your belief into the hand of Jesus.
Put your hand in the hand of the man, still the water. Put your hand in the hand of the man who calmed the sea. Take a good look at yourself, and you can look at others differently. Put your hand in the hand of the man from Galilee. Every time I look into the holy book, I want to tremble. When I read the part where the carpenter cleared the temple, and those buyers and sellers, no different fellow that you and I was to be. And it caused me shame to know that a man what you should be. Put your hand in the hand of the man, still the water. Put your hand in the hand of the man who calmed the sea. Take a look at yourself, and you can look at others differently. Put your hand in the hand of the man from Galilee. My mama taught me how to pray before I reached the age of 7. When I'm down on my knees, hey, I'm close to heaven. My daddy lived his life with 8 kids and a wife, and you gotta do what you gotta do. But it showed me enough what it takes to see you through. This is what it used to do. Put your hand in the hand of the man, still the water. Put your hand in the hand of the man who calmed the sea. You better take a good look at yourself, and you can look at others differently. Put your hand in the hand of the man from Galilee. man from Galilee. Put your hand in the hand of the man from Galilee.